The renovation of Hawthorne Manor began as an ordinary contract, the kind of project construction crews take on for the sake of restoring history into something modern and profitable. But Hawthorne Manor was not just any property. It had been abandoned for nearly a century, and the town around it spoke of it with a kind of wary silence. The house itself loomed like a forgotten sentinel on the edge of a forest, its windows blind, its walls sagging beneath decades of rot and weather. Every man who set foot near it felt the weight of its presence, though none said it aloud. And on the third day of work, while the crew descended into the lower floors, the basement became a stage for something none of them would forget. The air below was heavier than upstairs, as though it had been sealed for years. It smelled of damp stone and rusted iron pipes. Water dripped from somewhere distant, echoing in irregular beats like a clock that had long since lost its rhythm. Flashlights swept across brick walls, revealing crumbled shelves, broken crates, and the bones of forgotten furniture. But one worker stopped when his boot struck something that was not stone. The dull thud was deeper. It resonated like wood hollow and waiting. They bent down, clearing dust with their hands. The beam of a flashlight revealed a chest coated in layers of grime, so thick it looked like it had been asleep for generations. Its corners bound with iron that had turned a sick reddish brown from rust. The lock was weak and swollen, as if swollen shut by the years. One of the men gave it a kick, and it groaned open with a sound that made the others flinch, like a sigh rising out of the ground itself. Inside was not treasure, not jewels, not relics of gold, but something stranger, a book thick, leather-bound, cracked along the spine. The cover darkened like dried blood, brittle to the touch, as if the very air had starved it of life across its surface. Barely legible were the words etched long ago. Guests of Hawthorne Manor, 1903. The crew stared in silence, the sound of their breathing filling the basement. One of them reached for it, hesitating as though touching it would invite some kind of curse. And when his fingers brushed the cover, the leather was cold, colder than stone. They lifted it out, and the weight was surprising heavier than it should have been for mere paper dust curled into the air as the book met the light. The workers gathered around like children, afraid yet unable to look away. The title clearer. Now Guests of Hawthorne Manor, 1903. Each word scratched with care, yet now trembling as if time itself had tried to erase it. The foreman muttered that it was just an old registry, a relic, nothing more, perhaps left by the families who visited the estate. But even he could not disguise the unease in his voice. They flipped the first page, and the paper crackled with the sound of age. Signatures filled the opening in elegant script, names of men and women who had once walked the halls, laughter and dancing preserved in ink. Though the faces were long buried, each line marked with the confidence of the living yet. Even as the men flipped through the first few pages, the atmosphere seemed to shift, the basement darker than before, the edges of their flashlights swallowed as if the shadows had grown thicker. The book smelled faintly of smoke, though no flame had touched it. Their fingers left no smudge on the pages, no mark at all, as though the paper resisted the touch of the present. Questions filled the air. Why was this hidden and not kept upstairs? Why sealed in a chest? Why so carefully preserved in a place no guest would ever enter? The men felt a rising awareness that this was not just a ledger. It was a witness, a silent recorder of something that had taken place in Hawthorne Manor a century ago. One worker whispered that the names looked too perfect, too deliberate. Each signed with a hand that seemed careful not to reveal itself. No flourish, no individuality, just names stacked, one after another like tombstones in a row. It gave the impression of order, too much order, as if someone had written them all to give the illusion of visitors. The crew did not notice when the dripping of water stopped, or when the basement's air turned still like a vacuum pressing into their ears. They only noticed each other staring at the book, unable to set it back into the chest. unable to decide whether it should be destroyed or preserved. The longer they stared, the heavier the silence became. The youngest among them laughed nervously, suggesting they take it upstairs, maybe show it to the historian who was scheduled to survey the manor next week. But even as he spoke, his words felt weak. The others did not want to carry it beyond the basement walls because deep down they all sensed something they could not admit aloud. The book belonged to the darkness of that cellar. It was part of the foundation, not meant to leave. Yet curiosity has its own pull, and the foreman declared they would at least bring it into the light of day. Perhaps then its mystery would vanish under the sun. So they closed the chest with a hollow thud and carried the book in their hands, stepping carefully back up the stairs, each creak beneath their boots sounding louder than before. But as they climbed, each man felt the same thing. The weight of the book seemed to grow. It was heavy enough to drag their arms. It made the climb endless, each stair groaning under them, the air thickening the door. At the top, farther and farther, until finally they emerged into daylight, the dust of the basement still clinging to their skin. The moment the book touched sunlight, a strange silence fell over the manor. The birds outside stopped their song. The wind seemed to pause, leaves hanging motionless as if the world itself waited. The men exchanged uneasy glances. The foreman ran a thumb across the cracked leather once more, the title glaring at him, Guests of Hawthorne Manor, 1903. And in that instant, he felt it. This was not a book of guests. It was a ledger of something else, a record of those who had been claimed. He closed it quickly, but the silence lingered a warning. They had pulled something into the present, something that did not belong to them, something that had been sealed for reasons they would soon learn. Back in its prime, Hawthorne Manor stood like a jewel carved out of stone and shadow, its 3 stories rising above the valley, with windows that once blazed with light. The carriages of the wealthy lined the gravel path, the laughter of politicians, their wives, their children spilling through the gardens, and the air thick with the scent of roses and brandy music swelled from the ballroom strings, echoing through the hall's voices, merging with the clink of crystal glasses, the grand chandeliers dripping with firelight, every corner of the house alive with celebration. The paintings on the walls were of faces that stared down with a cold, timeless gaze. The Hawthorne family welcomed artists, poets, senators, men and women of influence. They promised them safety, luxury, and escape from the weight of the world. The manor became a stage for indulgence, rooms filled with velvet and oak guests wandering long corridors, their words carried like secrets by the draft that swept under the doors. It was a place where deals were whispered, where reputations were cemented, where rivalries dissolved over candlelight, or perhaps deepened in silence. The powerful came to dance and to scheme and to forget. Yet no matter how loud the music, how bright the chandeliers, there was always a strange undertone to Hawthorne Manor, an awareness that something beyond the festivities lingered in the air. The staff spoke of doors that refused to stay shut, of lights that flickered when no candle burned, of mirrors that reflected more than the room behind them. Guests dismissed these stories as foolish tales, servants exaggerating to feed their own boredom. But late at night, when the laughter died down, when the halls grew quiet, those same guests admitted hearing faint footsteps above their rooms long after everyone had retired, whispers carried through the floorboards, voices too distant to be real, yet too close to be imagined. By 1908, whispers began to leave the manor walls. They spread into the town below. The villagers said the house had become poisoned, not in the air or in the food, but in its spirit. The guests who visited left changed. Some returned pale, with eyes hollowed as though they had not slept in weeks. Others fell ill, their doctors unable to explain the sudden weakness that clung to their bones, and a few never returned at all. Their absence explained away with letters that no one ever saw, with excuses that made no sense. The manor swallowed names and sent silence in their place. By 1910, fewer carriages climbed the winding road to Hawthorne Manor. The once brilliant estate stood quieter, the windows darker, the laughter replaced by a stillness that pressed against the walls. The Hawthornes themselves withdrew from society. Their letters stopped arriving. Their invitations ceased. The family portraits draped in cloth as though the eyes within them had seen too much the grand. Piano in the ballroom untouched, its keys gathering dust where once symphonies rose into the night. Then came 1911, the year the manor sealed itself. The doors were locked with heavy chains, the windows barred from the inside. No announcement, no explanation, only a sudden absence. Those who dared approach the gates swore. They felt the air shift colder, sharper, as though the very grounds rejected them. The grass grew too quickly, curling up the iron fences. The roses withered in unnatural patterns, black at the edges, as if burned from within. The villagers called it poison. They said the house had feasted too long on the power that greed, the sin of its guests, and now it had turned inward. Devouring itself, they told their children never to wander near the estate. They drew signs across their doors when the wind carried the faint echo of a piano key struck in the empty halls. And yet behind the silence, behind the chains, Hawthorne Manor still breathed, the curtains still shifted, though no windows were open. The chimney exhaled faint wisps of smoke on nights when the moon hid her face, and the faintest trace of music sometimes lingered on the wind, as if the house was still alive, still hosting its eternal guests within halls. No living soul dared enter. The book began with a kind of elegance that almost felt reassuring. The first pages were filled with neat rows of names signed with the confidence of those who lived without fear, each line written in graceful flourishes that spoke of wealth and education. Men who owned banks, merchants who commanded ships, women wrapped in silk, their gloves perfumed with roses and powder. They left little messages beside their names, messages that captured the surface of joy and charm. Unforgettable stay the night of our lives. Blessed to be here, each note like a toast in ink, a celebration, frozen across paper. The pages smelled faintly of old tobacco and candle wax, as if the memories of those nights had been sealed into the fibers. The signatures carried a rhythm like music, their letters looping as though the writers smiled while they pressed their pens onto the parchment. The workers who opened the book felt at first a strange comfort. The idea that Hawthorne Manor once thrived with such grandeur that these pages were nothing more than a relic of an age long gone. But with each turn of the page, the handwriting began to shift. It was subtle at first, a letter leaning slightly too far, a word smudged as though the hand trembled while writing. The elegance faltered one entry. Wrote lovely house, though the letters dragged. Unevenly the next signed his name but left a faint blot of ink, like sweat had dropped onto the paper, and the further the book carried on, the more the cracks appeared. Soon the cheerful notes turned strange. The words chosen, without joy, one entry read, "I did not sleep well." Another only said, "The walls moved." Another scratched onto the page with such force the pen tore the paper. "We are not alone." The letters jagged as though carved instead of written. The workers flipped back and forth between these pages, their flashlights shaking over the ink, the cheerful beginnings already feeling false, a mask that slowly slipped away. The aristocrats who once signed with grandeur left their names unfinished, letters trailing off as if they had been interrupted, the ink darker in places where the nib pressed too hard, as if the writer fought against his own hand to finish the words. A few names appeared in frantic repetition, the same person writing again and again across the margin, as if desperate to remind the page that they existed, that they had not been erased. The script grew worse. Further on, what was once a book of order became disarray, some entries written sideways, some upside down, one scratched violently across another, as though silencing what had been written before. There were stains on certain pages, brown and faint yet spread like shadows. Fingerprints blurred along the edges of the paper where hands must have clutched too tightly. And then came the notes that chilled the workers. The first that read simply, "It is watching," the second signed by a man of politics, stating the halls echo when they should not. The third unsigned, no name, no title, only a line that read, "If you read this, do not stay." The ink faded almost gray, as though the page itself tried to swallow the words, turning further. The handwriting no longer looked human. Some letters stretched into jagged lines, others curled unnaturally, the sentences incoherent. The ink blotched like spilled blood across the parchment, and in between the words faint scratches appeared, marks that looked like they had been dug into the page by nails rather than pen strokes. The elegance was gone, replaced with desperation. The men holding the book said nothing as they turned each page, but their silence was louder than speech. They all felt it, the journey from laughter to fear, from elegance to madness. Each page a step deeper into something that had consumed the manor. It was no longer just a guest book. It had become a record of descent. And when they reached the final set of these disturbed entries, the last lines were barely words at all. The letters twisted into symbols, not quite language, not quite gibberish, a message meant to be felt rather than read. And on the final page before the section ended, there was no name, only a phrase written in shaky hand. The ink smeared like tears upon the parchment. "We should never have written." The workers closed the book for a moment, their hands trembling, none of them willing to admit what they all thought. The signatures had begun with pride and ended with fear. And somewhere between the lines, something had touched the guests of Hawthorne Manor, something that turned celebration into warning, something that whispered through ink. By the middle of 1903, the guest book no longer carried the polished weight of elegance it once displayed. The ink that had begun with grace now carried unease. The words no longer invitations to memory, but warnings written in a hand that seemed unwilling to hold the pen. Guests who once celebrated the luxury of Hawthorne Manor now confessed what they could not ignore. Restless nights, voices that carried through the silence, scratching behind the walls as though something crawled and burrowed within the very bones of the house. The entries spoke of men who heard footsteps echo across the east wing. Though they swore, they were the only ones awake. One woman wrote that she saw candlelight in a corridor where no candles had been placed. Another said the mirrors reflected more than her face, for in their depths she saw a shadow standing where no person stood. These were not exaggerations written in haste. They carried attention in every letter, the kind that clings to a writer as their hand shakes between the need to confess and the terror of what that confession might summon. What unsettled the workers who read the book was not just the words themselves, but the pattern that began to emerge. Several names were violently crossed out, thick black lines dragging through them as though someone sought to erase their existence. The scratches cut deep into the page, tearing the parchment in places, ink smeared like wounds. It was as if the book itself wanted to forget those people, or perhaps the house demanded it. The names were blotted into silence, leaving only fragments of who they were. A banker from Philadelphia, a painter from London, a girl listed only as Marjorie. Her name slashed away until only broken letters remained. The handwriting grew more frantic as the months of 1903 went on. One guest wrote in a sprawling, desperate scrawl, "The house will not sleep." Another wrote, "I hear them at my door, though none knock." One line carved so deeply it bled through several pages said, "Do not stay past the third night." The words pressed again and again until the nib split, leaving ragged marks like claws rather than letters. Some notes became incomplete, a half-finished sentence trailing off into blankness. as if the writer had been interrupted, pulled away before the thought was complete. One wrote, "I felt the bed move as if someone lay beside me. But when I turned there was no," and it ended abruptly. The rest of the page empty. The next signature, dated the following day, belonged to a man who scrawled simply, "I should not have stayed," and then there were the voices mentioned again and again. The East Wing appeared in nearly every note. The East Wing whispers. The East Wing sings. The East Wing waits. One particularly chilling entry had no signature at all, but read, "I do not write this of my own hand," and beneath it faint smudges of fingerprints, as if the ink had been smeared by trembling skin. The more pages turned, the heavier the silence became. The workers, flipping through them, could almost hear the echoes of the words, not just read them. The scratching behind the walls became more than ink. It became a sound, they imagined, filling the manor itself, creeping through the pipes, through the wood, through the veins of the house, as though the structure was alive and shifting, and as if to confirm this dread, the entries began to overlap. Names written on top of one another as though more than one hand tried to claim the same space. The margins filled with illegible notes, words written upside down or sideways, impossible to follow, like voices competing in a dark room, fighting to be heard. Guests who had once basked in the glory of Hawthorne Manor now left warnings scratched into the ledger, like men and women trapped, leaving marks before the end-on page near the center was almost entirely erased. Long lines of ink clawed across the parchment, obscuring whatever had been written beneath. Only faint impressions remained, words carved deep enough that even erasure could not hide them. It read, "I am not myself," followed by a scrawl that might have been a name or might have been something older, something less human. The crossing out of names spread with every page until entire lists of visitors were blackened, gone as though history itself had been rewritten. The book no longer a guest registry but a graveyard, where some were allowed to remain and others were condemned to vanish. No explanation, only silence. The last note before this section ended was written in a hand barely legible, the ink shaking across the paper. The message clear. "I fear it will sign for me soon." The name beneath was a smear of ink, impossible to decipher, as though the act of signing had been stolen from the writer. The workers closed the book on this passage, their mouths dry, their eyes darting across the basement walls. They could almost hear it, the restless nights, the scratching, the voices in the East Wing, and they knew then that the book was not simply telling them about the past. It was breathing those nights back into the present. Each word a fragment of the manor itself, reminding them that those who once tried to escape could never truly erase their names. Only a handful of entries remained after August 1903, and those final lines carried the weight of something that felt like the closing of a chapter. The pages no longer crowded with the elegant parade of visitors that once filled the book. Instead, they thinned into silence, a slow dwindling, as if the house itself grew weary of recording, or perhaps weary of allowing more names within its walls. The ink grew darker, the spacing wider, and what remained were not the words of celebration, but the last breaths of those who dared stay. The first was a banker from Boston, his signature scrawled in haste, his note, unusually brief compared to the flourished remarks of earlier pages. He wrote simply, "I cannot sleep. The hallways move at night." The letters cramped together as though his hand shook. The workers stared at the line, knowing the simplicity carried a heavier truth than the elaborate confessions before it. The next entry belonged to a poet from New York, his name known in circles at the time, his verses celebrated in salons across the city. Yet here in the guest book, his words were stripped of beauty and form, reduced to a terrified confession. He wrote, "The East Wing sings my name, though no lips move." He underlined the phrase twice, as if desperate to force the reader to understand his dread. Beneath his name, a blot of ink spread like a drop of blood frozen into the parchment. The poet would later vanish from public record, his final, published poem appearing in a magazine weeks after this visit. No one realized until much later that the poem contained the same phrase, "The East Wing sings my name." Then came the nameless family, their presence marked only by 3 words, 3 souls, no titles, no identities, no city of origin. Whoever recorded them either chose not to reveal themselves or was denied the right to do so. The handwriting was clumsy, as if written in fear, or by someone unaccustomed to writing. Their note was shorter, "Still we are not alone," nothing else. No attempt at explanation, no elaboration. Just the stark message like a cry carved into stone. The workers who read it felt their stomachs twist, because in its simplicity, it carried more horror than all the elaborate warnings that came before it. The spacing of the entries grew wider. After that the pages turned but remained empty. Yellowed paper waiting yet untouched. The emptiness itself spoke louder than ink. It said the visits had stopped the house no longer. Entertained not because it had fallen out of fashion, but because those who entered did not return. Or perhaps the book had simply refused to record more names, as though it had reached its limit, as though it had chosen its final words. The workers argued quietly in the basement about what it meant. One said the family must have been forgotten. Another muttered that no one forgets 3 souls, no names, no story unless the house itself wanted them erased. The youngest among them whispered that maybe the house had kept them, that they never left the manor at all, and that was why their names were absent. The silence in the room pressed closer around them. The dust in the air thick as if listening. The guestbook heavy in their hands, pages that should have been light with time now dragging like stone. The idea that those last entries were not just memories but warnings grew stronger, each man replaying the words in his mind. "I cannot sleep. The hallways move at night. The East Wing sings my name. We are not alone." The repetition gave the impression of a chant, one that still echoed in the house, though written more than a century ago. As the men stood there with the book open to the last filled page, the air grew colder. Their breath faint in the beams of their flashlights. One of them swore he heard a faint tapping like fingernails against wood somewhere beyond the basement wall. Another said it was just the pipes, but his own voice betrayed doubt. They all glanced at the book still open to the words, "We are not alone," and in that moment the silence of the room seemed to answer back. One worker suggested they stop reading, close the book, and put it back into the chest before they saw more, but none of them moved, because despite their fear there was a pull in those last entries, an unfinished feeling as if turning one more page might reveal something left behind, something hidden between the lines. The guest book felt alive with expectation. The emptiness beyond the final entry, like a held breath waiting to be broken. And when they did turn the page, what awaited was not another name, but faint scratches, almost invisible unless the light struck just right. Shallow marks that looked less like pen strokes and more like claws dragged across the parchment, as if someone or something had tried to write but could not form words. The marks repeated again and again, 3 parallel lines etched into the paper, the number 3 echoing the nameless family. 3 souls. The men closed the book quickly, but the silence of the basement had changed. It was no longer just empty air. It was charged, filled with the suggestion of presence, and though none of them admitted it aloud, they all carried the same thought. The final visitors of Hawthorne Manor were not only remembered in ink, they were still there, unseen in the walls, in the shadows, in the air, and their last message, "We are not alone," was not a warning for the past. It was a truth for the present. Near the end of the book, the steady march of names and desperate notes suddenly broke, one page missing, torn out with such violence that the ragged edges still clung to the binding like wounds. The workers stared at it, the silence between them stretching, because the absence of words was somehow more terrifying than the words themselves. Whoever had written on that page had not simply been removed, they had been erased. Fragments of ink remained along the edges, thin lines bleeding into the paper, where the page had been ripped away, the marks jagged and uneven as though the pen had been pressed in panic. The strokes heavy, the last movements of a hand that did not want to stop but was forced to. The basement air seemed to grow heavier as they examined it, their flashlights catching the faint stain of black where ink had bled into the fibers. The more they stared, the more it looked less like ink and more like dried blood, the edges frayed in a way that suggested the paper had been yanked, not carefully cut, not delicately removed, but torn with desperation, perhaps by someone who did not want those words to survive, or perhaps by someone who feared them too much to let them remain. The imagination of the men ran wild, each of them filling the silence with their own ideas of what had been written there. One thought it must have been the final confession of a guest who had seen too much. Another muttered that it might have been a description, not of the house, but of something inside. It's something that should never have been put into words. The youngest whispered that maybe the writer had managed to sign their name, but the house itself tore it free as if unwilling to let them escape its memory. The missing page became more terrifying, the longer they looked at it, because a missing piece invites the mind to fill it, and the human mind always fills it with something worse than truth. The book seemed to resist being questioned, the way the spine bent inward around the tear as if, protecting a secret it did not wish to share. The fragments of ink seemed to shift in the light, curling into shapes that resembled letters, though none could be clearly seen, as if the ghost of the words still clung to the ruin of the pageant of. The men suggested perhaps the missing page still existed somewhere else in the manor, hidden in another chest, slipped beneath the floorboards, sealed behind the walls. But another countered sharply that it was better lost, because what kind of words demanded such violence to erase them? What kind of words had the power to scare the writer into tearing them from history? The silence of the basement was broken only by the faint creak of the house above, the sound of old beams straining against time. Yet to the men, it felt like something listening, leaning closer as they studied the wound in the book. The youngest swore he felt a draft, though the basement was sealed, as if air moved where it should not. He closed his eyes and thought he heard the faintest whisper pressing from the torn space of the book. Not words, only sound, like the scraping of ink across paper in a room without light. The missing page became the loudest part of the book because it refused to explain itself. Each of the filled pages had told a story of descent from laughter to dread, but the missing page said nothing, and in saying nothing it screamed the loudest. The absence was deliberate silence, deliberate erasure. Silence, chosen not by time but by Willen. Then one of the men noticed something that made the others draw closer. At the very bottom of the torn section where the page had ripped unevenly, there was a faint indentation. Not ink, but pressure. The mark of a hand pressed hard enough into the paper to leave its memory. Though the page itself was gone, it was the outline of fingers clawing down the margin, as though whoever wrote had tried to hold on to the paper as it was torn away. 5 faint grooves carved into the page, like the last attempt to resist being erased. They stared at those grooves, their hearts pounding, their minds racing to imagine the scene. Had the writer been in panic, tearing the page free themselves, or had someone else taken it from them while they fought to keep their words alive? Whichever answer was true, both carried the same weight. Someone had written something they believed should not survive. When the men closed the book, at last, they did so slowly, as though afraid to disturb the wound within, and in the silence that followed, one thought returned again and again. The page was missing, but that did not mean it was gone. It could be somewhere, still within the house, waiting, folded between floorboards, pressed into the walls, hidden in the dark corners of the manor. And if the page still remained, Then so did the words so dangerous, so unbearable, that even the book itself could not contain them. And as they placed the book back into the chest, the youngest swore he heard the faint tear of paper somewhere in the house above them, as though another page had just been ripped away. The second to last signature in the book belonged, not to a guest or a traveler or some wealthy socialite, but to the man who had lived in the shadow of Hawthorne Manor every day of his life, the caretaker, his name written in a hand that was weary and precise. The date, September 14th, 1903. His entry was not a cheerful memory nor a cryptic complaint, but a single sentence carved into the page with such force the nib of his pen must have bent. This house should not remember. The words were stark, devoid of ornament. They read less like a remark, and more like a command or perhaps a plea. The workers stared at them, their flashlights trembling over the uneven letters. The phrase unsettled them, not because of what it said, but because of what it implied. What could a house remember? What memories were too dangerous to remain? What had the caretaker seen in the corridors, in the rooms, in the cellars that made him believe memory itself was poison? Before this entry, the book had been filled with the voices of outsiders, visitors who came and left their warnings behind. But this was different. This was the voice of someone who knew the manor more intimately than anyone else, the man who walked its halls at night, who locked its doors, who tended its gardens. He had not been a guest. He had been part of the house itself, and if he wrote that it should not remember, then he must have witnessed what memory had done. After September 14th, no record of him remained in the town archives. His small cottage near the edge of the estate stood empty. His bed still made, his clothes still folded, his lantern still hanging by the door. But the man himself gone, as if he had been swallowed by the house he had served for decades. The villagers whispered that he had fled in the night. Others said he was buried in the wall. Some claimed they saw him wandering the grounds without light, his eyes pale and blank, as though the house had already taken his memory for itself. The words "this house should not remember" echoed in the minds of the workers as they stared at the page. What did the caretaker mean? Did the house itself hold memories of those who stayed? Did it keep their voices, their fears, their final moments trapped within its walls? Did the guest book serve not as a record, but as a key that allowed the house to relive each soul that had passed through it? One of the men traced the letters with his finger. Though the ink was faded, the grooves were still deep, etched into the page like scars. He whispered that the caretaker must have tried to warn anyone who opened the book after him to burn it, to bury it, to keep it closed so that the house could finally forget. But instead, here it was in their hands, breathing again, the memory resurrected by their curiosity. The town had its own stories of the caretaker. Some said he had been loyal beyond reason, that he refused to leave, even after the Hawthorne family began to withdraw from society. Others claimed he had grown bitter, his loyalty rotting into resentment, and that he had written his final words in anger. But the book did not lie. The tone of his handwriting was not rage, it was fear, not of the family, not of the guests, but of the house itself. The men in the basement debated in hushed voices what might have happened. After that entry, one suggested that the caretaker had signed the book because he knew he would not live another day. Another said he might have been taken by the same force that had crossed out names, erased lives, pulled the ink out of the page itself. The youngest said nothing. He only stared at the words. This house should not remember, repeating them silently in his head until they became something else. This house does not forget. And that thought settled in him, heavier than the dust, heavier than the dark that pressed around them. The caretaker had vanished not into the world, but into the memory of the manor itself. The house did not release its servants. It did not release its guests. It kept them all woven into its walls, locked inside, its echoes bound in its guest book like insects preserved in amber. After September 14th, the town refused to speak his name. When asked, they turned away, muttering only that he had gone and that the house was better left alone. But silence is its own confession. Silence says more than words ever can, and in their refusal they admitted what they feared. He had not gone anywhere. He was still there, walking the corridors, tending to the house, serving not as caretaker, but as memory itself. The book seemed to pulse in the hands of the workers, the ink alive with a weight that pressed deeper than any living voice this house should not remember. Yet it did, and it always would. The caretaker had tried to resist, had left his warning, but the house had claimed him anyway, turning his plea into nothing more than another memory written on a fading page. And as the workers closed the book again, the oldest among them muttered under his breath, almost without realizing it, that the caretaker was probably still there, keeping watch with hollow eyes in the dust of the east wing, ensuring that the house never forgot, ensuring that it remembered every soul who ever wrote its pages, even those who had begged to be forgotten. The final entry was, "The wound that silenced the room." The trembling ink carried the weight of something impossible, something that should not exist. The date was October 1st, 1903, and beneath it a single name, Margaret Hawthorne, the lady of the house, the woman whose death certificate lay in town records dated September 17th. Her body said to have been discovered lifeless in her bedroom by the maid who ran screaming into the streets. The townspeople had buried her with prayers and whispers, and yet here her name was, written 2 weeks after she was already gone. The men who found it stared without breathing, their eyes tracing the shaky letters over and over, each stroke of the pen uneven as though guided by a trembling hand, or a hand that no longer belonged to the living. One of them whispered that it must be a mistake. Perhaps another hand had written her name. But the ink told another story, the force of the pen pressing deep into the paper, the way the letters bled into the fibers like veins. It was not imitation. It was confession. Whoever wrote this had meant to be Margaret Hawthorne, or worse, had been her. The silence of the basement grew heavy enough to crush them, as though the house leaned closer to hear their thoughts. Margaret had been the heart of Hawthorne Manor, the one who threw lavish dinners, whose laughter filled the ballroom, whose portrait still hung above the grand staircase with eyes that followed visitors down the hallways. Her death had been the reason many believed. The house cursed because from the moment she was laid in the ground, the manor was never the same. Music stopped, doors were locked, windows shuttered, and within a year the estate was abandoned. But if she had signed the guest book after her burial, then death had not ended her presence in the manor. It had only deepened it. The entry itself was short. No message, no farewell, no desperate warning. Only her name, as if the very act of inscribing it was enough, as if the book itself had demanded. It claimed her the way it had claimed every guest, every servant, every soul that lingered within its walls. The youngest worker's hand shook as he traced the letters. He said he could almost feel warmth rising from the page, as if the ink had not yet dried, as if the act of writing had been recent, not a century old. The others pulled him back, frightened of his closeness, because the book seemed to breathe with each touch, the name pulsing in the dim light as though written not with ink but with something drawn directly from the grave. Rumors of Margaret's death had never been simple. The maid who discovered her swore her body was twisted, as though she had struggled against something unseen. The doctor who signed the certificate wrote heart failure, but his notes in the archive suggested hesitation. Townsfolk whispered she had been taken, not by illness but by the house itself, that the walls had pressed in, that the air had stolen her breath, that the mirrors had trapped her reflection until her body could no longer hold what was missing. Now seeing her name carved into the guest book, weeks later, it felt less like rumor and more like truth. One of the men muttered that perhaps she had never left the house at all, that the coffin buried in the churchyard was only a husk, while something else, something not entirely human, lingered here, and claimed her own name in ink. The others shushed him, but the idea had already taken root in all of them, because the letters trembled not from an unsteady hand, but from resistance, as though each curve and line was written against the weight of death itself. The basement seemed colder, the shadows deeper, the air heavy with a stillness that pressed against their lungs, and as they turned the page hoping for more explanation, there was nothing blank. Sheets followed empty and unmarked, as though the book itself had ended not by accident but by design. Her name was the final word, the closing seal, the last claim of Hawthorne Manor, and in that silence they understood the caretaker's warning. This house should not remember, but it had, and what it remembered, it refused to let go. They closed the book, but the name stayed with them, echoing in their minds, echoing in the creak of the floorboards above, in the distant sigh that moved through the air ducts, in the faint whisper of paper that seemed to shift even though no one touched it. Margaret Hawthorne, the lady of the house, the woman who had died and yet signed her name in trembling ink, as if to say she still belonged to the manor, as if to say she never left and when. They carried the book up the basement steps. The youngest swore that for a moment in the corner of the stairwell they passed her portrait, but the painted eyes had shifted, no longer gazing down the hallway but directly at him, watching her name. Returned to memory her presence, awakened by their discovery. And somewhere deep in the house where the walls met in silence, he thought he heard a woman's voice whisper his name. The handwriting was perfect, the same sweeping curves, the same deliberate flourishes, the same pressure of the pen pressing deep into the fibers of the page. It matched every earlier entry she had made when she was alive, but now those same letters appeared beneath a date that came after her funeral, after her coffin had been lowered into the ground, after the earth had already claimed her. The men stared because the fact could not be explained by accident or coincidence. The strokes were too exact, too personal. Two alive whispers rippled among them. One said it must have been forgery, perhaps a cruel trick by someone who had loved her or hated her enough to mock her memory, perhaps a servant who knew her hand well enough to mimic it. But even as the word left his lips, the others knew it was a lie. The signature was not imitation, it was presence. Each curve carried the weight of intention, each letter trembling as though written by fingers. Unsteady, not with inexperience, but with something heavier, something colder. The silence pressed tighter around them, and the thought none of them wanted to speak came alive, that Margaret had written it herself, that she had reached through the soil, through the coffin, through death itself, to leave her name in the book one final time, as if to say she was still bound to the house, or worse, never left it at all. Rumors had always clung to Hawthorne Manor like ivy. The idea that the house itself breathed, that the walls listened, that the mirrors remembered. But now those rumors seemed less like stories and more like instructions, pieces of a truth everyone had been too afraid to assemble. Some whispered that the book was not just a record, but a vessel, that it did not collect memories but consumed them, that each name written became part of the manor itself, and that the house had demanded Margaret back, rewriting her with its own hand. The youngest among them muttered that maybe the manor had not let her die fully. Maybe when the coffin closed, her body was only part of her, and the rest remained behind, woven into the stone and wood of the house that had owned her life. Her laughter, her despair, her secrets for decades. Maybe the book was only the place where the house revealed its ownership. A ledger not of guests, but of souls. The older man shook his head and insisted again on forgery, but his voice cracked under the weight of it, because even he saw the tremor in the letters, the hesitation that only a dying hand could leave, and none of them could ignore the pressure in the air, as though the house itself leaned forward, listening to their denial, daring them to dismiss what they saw before them. The idea grew darker, the more they considered it. What if the manor itself wrote her back into existence? What if the ink was not ink, at all, but something drawn from the walls, from the shadows, from the marrow of the house itself. What if the guest book was the tongue, the hand, the voice of Hawthorne Manor writing, not what was, but what must be, and Margaret Hawthorne had been too, important too, central, too beloved by the house to be allowed to fade her death. Simply a formality, her presence inked back into life with trembling letters. Their flashlights shook over the page. The name seemed almost to waver in the beam, as though it was still being written, letter by letter, line by line, repeating itself in an endless loop. Each time they blinked, it seemed darker, fresher, closer, and the longer they stared, the more each of them felt the same thing. Not fear, but recognition. Recognition, as though they had seen her before in their dreams or their memories. Though none of them had ever met her, it was not forgery. It was not imitation. It was resurrection. And if the house had the power to bring her name back from death, then perhaps it had the power to do far more. Perhaps it had always been doing so, writing and rewriting its guests, weaving them into its fabric, ensuring that no one who entered truly left. The men closed the book, but none of them spoke. The silence was too loud, filled with questions they could not voice, but each of them carried the same thought, though none dared to admit it. If the house could write Margaret Hawthorne back into existence, then maybe it could write them too, and maybe it already had. When the chest was closed again, the air in the basement did not fall silent. It thickened the way it does before a storm, and in that dense hush came a sound, faint but undeniable. The sound of a pen scratching against paper, slow, deliberate strokes, echoing where no hand moved. The workers froze their breaths, caught in their throats. The chest was sealed, the book inside untouched, yet the noise persisted, like something hidden was still writing. Its truth pressing its words into the pages. They could not see. Not one of them dared to lift the lid again. Their courage had already bled away like ink across torn paper. They carried the chest from the manor, their hands trembling, their eyes never leaving the locked wood even as the daylight hit their faces outside. They whispered nothing to each other, for fear that words might summon back the sound of that pentaday. The guest book lies in a locked archive far from Hawthorne Manor, guarded not for preservation, but for containment. It sits under glass with guards who do not understand why they must never open it. They only follow the rule passed down by those first workers. Never turn its cover, never touch its pages, never tempt it to remember again. The few who have seen it claim the leather cover shifts under the light like breathing. Some say the edges of the torn page seem darker each year, as if new ink bleeds slowly from wounds that never heal. And those who listen long enough swear they hear it. The faint dragging of a nib across parchment, the slow, steady sound of handwriting that should not exist. The question that lingers is the one no one wishes to answer if another page has already been filled. If unseen hands have continued the guest book, then whose name lies there now? Is it one of the workers who carried it from the house? Is it one of the archivists who swore to protect it? Is it a name that has not yet been spoken by the living but waits in the dark to reveal itself? Each year when October returns, when the nights grow long and the air grows cold, the archivists claim the scratching grows louder. Louder until it feels as if it comes from the very walls of the building. Some believe the house itself, even sealed and abandoned, reaches through the book to pull more souls inside, as if Hawthorne Manor is not bound to stone and wood, but to the pages that carry its memory, and so the chest remains locked. The key rarely touched, the guest book trapped but never silenced. Because the truth is, not whether the book is still being written. The truth is that the house will always remember. The truth is that the question is not who signed it last, but who is signing it now, and perhaps who will sign it next.